Hello, in this video I want to talk about drawing waves in charcoal, and this is a drawing I just finished, and there's also a ship in this scene, but I'm not going to be talking about that now. I'm going to do a separate video on that. I wanted to do a simple tutorial on how to draw some waves, and these are relatively simple. They can get a lot more complex. And before I move on to the video of the drawing process, I'm just going to grab a piece of paper and talk a little bit about the basic shapes of waves and how you can draw them in charcoal. The first thing I'm going to do is grab a piece of vine charcoal. I'm going to use vine charcoal because it's very easy to manipulate and it's good for sketching. So I'm just going to lay that down a little bit to create some mid-tone and smudge it around with my finger. And like I said, this is just going to be a quick demonstration, and I'm not too worried about the fact that this is uneven. That's not a problem. It will make my water look more interesting without much effort. So now I'm just going to draw some basic shapes of waves. And waves have their high points and low points. They're almost like hills or mountain tops. And the high points are called the crest, and the low points are called the trough. So I'm just going to smudge that a little bit with my finger and with a brush. Alright. So now you'll notice that this tip here, the high point, is shorter and almost forms a point, unlike the trough, which is longer and smoother. Now, if you want to draw a wave in front of the other wave, you won't draw it like this, parallel to one another. What you want to do is kind of stack them like this so that they're overlapping, and so that this highest point or high point of the wave in front is sort of overlapping with the low point of the waves behind. So now I blended that a little bit with my finger, and you can see the basic shapes of waves appearing now. Now if you want to draw more waves behind these waves, you need to keep in mind that the further you go back into the distance, the smaller they will be getting. So if you want to draw some waves here in the back, they're going to be getting smaller and smaller. You don't have to be really precise, but you just have to make the ones in the back smaller so that they're almost becoming less defined and disappearing and merging into the distance. Now I'm going to draw some lighter portions of these waves and draw some highlights. So I'm using my pencil eraser and drawing some highlights on top of these waves. And you'll notice that I'm trying to keep my lightest point around the high point of the wave, and then it's sort of becoming more smooth as I go further down the wave towards the low point. So these are some of the basic rules when drawing waves. Like I said, this is the simpler version, and there's really not much to it other than just studying reference photos and practicing. Like I said, this can get a lot more complex because each wave consists of many smaller waves and ripples, so they can get a lot more complex. Now, another thing is that if you want to make these waves look like they're on a rough sea, like the water is splashing, as is the case in my drawing that I'm about to show, then you're just going to have to make these highlights or these top parts of the waves a little more rough, and just try to make it look like they're crashing and the water is splashing around. So that's it for now. Let's move on to the video of my drawing process. I already have a sketch of a ship here. It's leaning slightly to one side. Like I said, I'm not going to show you the whole thing now. I'm just going to focus on the waves. And I was thinking about whether I should start with vine charcoal or a charcoal pencil. And I decided to start with charcoal pencil and draw a little bit of that ship, the lower part of the hull, where the water will be foaming and splashing as the ship is breaking through the waves. So after that I decided to do a few suggestions of waves with charcoal pencil, because I figured I was going to go over it with vine charcoal. So I wanted these darker shapes to remain even when I cover them with vine charcoal, because vine charcoal is easy to manipulate and move around. So if I started blending, I might lose some of the shapes I created initially. So I decided to use a charcoal pencil first, and then vine charcoal on top of it. And a charcoal pencil that I'm using is a woodless charcoal pencil, so that's essentially compressed charcoal that can be sharpened like a pencil. And it's a little bit darker, and it's a little more difficult to erase. So now I'm going to use this tortillon, which is an old and used up tortillon, which works just as well. And I'm going to use it to soften some of these waves a little bit, and spread that charcoal a little bit to remove some of the texture I created with a pencil by scribbling. And you can already see that some of these waves or wave patterns are starting to show up. Now they look quite irregular, but that's what I want, because the sea is rough and the ship is kind of disturbing the surface of the sea even more. And now I'm going over it with vine charcoal, which is quite a bit softer, and it's going to be easy to blend and lift up if necessary. That's why I put down these darker areas first. These are going to be a little more difficult to move. So now I'm using a paper towel to blend that vine charcoal a little bit, to spread that around. And I'm trying to leave the white space around the bottom of the ship where the foamy splashing water will be. And here I'm adding a little more darker values to these waves. And as I've explained previously, I always need to keep in mind that they have their high points and low points, and that they are getting a little bit smaller as you go further into the distance. And then I'm going to be drawing highlights later with a pencil eraser or a kneaded eraser. I'm just going to leave it like that in the edges because I want to create a vignette. I'm not going to be drawing all the way to the edge of the paper, but I'm just trying to vary the surface of the water a little bit more and to create more variation within the waves themselves, because as I've tried to explain, each wave consists of many smaller waves and ripples. That's why I keep adding a little more of this vine charcoal to create a little more variation, a little more ripples in there, so that these larger shapes, larger waves appear even more complex. This is a simpler way of drawing waves, but I'm just trying to create an illusion of more detail. Like I put in a lot more effort into it than I actually did, even though the portion of the drawing with the waves probably took no more than 30 or 40 minutes, probably even less. So I'm blending that in a little bit with a brush, always softening it a little bit with a soft brush. And if I feel like I've spoiled some of the shapes, I can go back in with wine charcoal and add a little more until I'm happy with the shapes I created. Like I said at the beginning of the video, they do kind of look like hills or mountain tops rising up above the surface of the water. So that's what I'm going for. And here this part of the hull of the ship is going to be a little bit darker, so that I can create enough contrast with the splashing water underneath. And I want these high points to be a little bit darker, just below the highlights that I'm going to draw. I feel like I need a little more here to create suggestions of waves here and there. And since vine charcoal is very easy to move around, I often have to go over a certain area with a charcoal pencil just to make it a little bit darker. So I'm just going to add a few more of these dark areas before I move on to drawing highlights. Now I grab a pencil eraser and I try to make the tip sharp, but the thing is that I have to create a lot of contrast here. I want these lighter portions of the wave, these highlights on top of the wave, on the crest, to be a lot lighter, to create a lot of contrast, so that I can give the drawing some illusion of depth and of the shape of those waves. So I want these areas to be very light, almost white. Of course they can't be completely white because they've been covered with charcoal, but because the charcoal is so dark and relatively easy to erase, I should be able to create a sufficient amount of contrast. You can also notice that I'm adding some of these smaller spots and lines in between the waves here. Like I'm trying to suggest that they're not one single uniform shape, but they consist of many smaller waves. So I'm going to keep drawing these highlights and occasionally going back in with the blending tool. But you can see that now I'm drawing some of these ripples in between, and I really want the water around the ship to be splashing. There's another couple of waves here which are breaking into a couple of smaller waves. Like I said, the sea is a little bit rough. That's what I was going for in this little drawing. And I want some more waves here. And like I said, I'm just putting down some of these white lines in between to break the structure a little bit, to make it more interesting. When you do this, it's good to have a reference photo. I was looking at a couple of reference photos, but the thing is that waves can get pretty complex and daunting, and I'm not really an expert, but I'm just trying to imitate the basic shape and structure of waves, while at the same time trying to create an illusion of detail and complexity. So I'm kind of hoping that I'll be able to trick your eye, that I've put in a lot of work into these waves in order to make them look realistic. But hopefully I'll be able to create something that looks realistic with a little less effort. This habit of trying to create things that look realistic with as little effort as possible is not just a result of laziness. It comes from the fact that I started drawing by studying comic books and trying to draw my own comic books. So one of the things characteristic about comic book drawings is that you're trying to create more with less, with fewer lines. You're just creating some suggestions and hoping that the mind and the imagination will fill in the rest. So you can see that I grabbed a couple more of these pencil erasers just to have a clean, short tip, sharp tip at hand, because the tip kept getting dirty and dull, so I wasn't really happy with the highlights I was getting. So I just grabbed a couple more clean ones and sharp ones to see if I can come up with some better looking waves. And like I said, I'm going to do a separate video on the ship as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the ship. But we can do that some other time. Right now I just wanted to show you this drawing of waves. I'm just randomly adding some more lines here and there, just to make the surface of the water look more complex. The sea is really rough and the water is splashing and waves are crashing against one another and against the ship, which is breaking through the waves and leaning slightly towards one side. And now I'm using my kneaded eraser to clean up some of these highlights and to clean up the area around the ship, as well as the edges of my drawing. Although most of the time I used a pencil eraser, I think that for these smaller shapes that require more precision, I think that a pencil eraser is a lot better. I don't have a Tombow Mono Zero eraser. I probably should get that somehow. That would allow for even more precision when erasing, but these work fine. Anyway, I'm mostly done, and now I'm just cleaning up a little bit to make my vignette look a little bit better. And once I finish with that, I'm gonna be moving on to the ship. I'm just gonna use the brush to soften the edges just a little bit and get them to look the way I like it. So like I said, this is mostly done. That's what the waves are going to look like. I hope you enjoyed this little drawing and maybe some of you found it useful. Now I'm going to be moving on to the ship. Thanks for watching.